Today's guest on a Life and a Living podcast is Jessie Smith. Now, Jessie is a highly qualified and experienced lawyer. She's also the director of the Criminal Justice Innovation Lab in Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And the reason I wanted to have Jessie on the podcast, because I don't have too many lawyers on the podcast, is to talk about the whole principle of second chance and also the overcriminalization, the system in the USA and the impact that it's had. And the reason I really wanted to have it up, because it is directly connects to hiring people, accessing people, and retaining people, which is a big challenge for so many of the organizations that I deal with. And this is actually bringing between 37 and 40 million back into the pool that you can recruit from. And really wanted to get Jessie to explain it, give the background to it, and how organizations could go and access this extraordinary pool that is available to them, but heretofore that probably been the door was being shut to them. So I'm delighted to have Jessie here, and I want you to sit back, listen, and enjoy this interview with Jessie Smith. Jessie, it's a great honor to have you here today with us on a Life and a Living podcast, all the way from North Carolina.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Listen, just so, because a particular subject I want to talk to you about, because I heard you speak about it and it's a great interest to me. But just to give a bit of background, you're a lawyer. You're the director of the Criminal Justice Innovation Lab in Chapel Hill in North Carolina. So maybe just explain exactly what the Innovation Lab is.
Sure. The Innovation Lab is a center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a major research university in the US. And at the Criminal Justice Innovation Lab, we're focused on promoting a fair and effective criminal justice system, public safety, and economic prosperity through an evidence-based approach to criminal justice issues. And the way we do that is really pretty simple. We educate stakeholders about issues. We work with them, supporting their efforts to develop and then implement consensus solutions. And then we follow up on their work doing empirical evaluations so that they can understand the impact of their efforts.
Very interesting. I was actually one of the subject matter that you were talking about, that I heard you talk about, which is about the whole, the subject of overcriminalization. And maybe you can talk a little bit to that, but in particularly, the whole concept of second chance and how that plays out or not, or how it can play out. Because I felt that was actually a great opportunity for organizations to get their heads around. And also to kind of get over some of maybe biases that would exist there. Maybe just talk a little bit about the overcriminalization and also how the whole second chance came around and the implication of that.
Sure, that's a lot of topics to unpack.
Sorry. Yeah.
So I'll do them in a couple of pieces. So one of the things that's happened in the United States is that policymakers have come to view the criminal law as kind of a hammer, and they see every social ill then as a nail. And so it used to be the case that the criminal law was relatively limited in coverage. It covered conduct that you and I would clearly understand should be subject to the harshest type of control, regulation through the criminal system. Conduct like murder and rape and arson and major larceny. But over the decades, what's happened is the criminal law has expanded so dramatically that it now covers a vast array of conduct, including activities that would leave a lot of people really scratching their heads and wondering, is this the kind of stuff that really deserves the penalties, the incredibly harsh penalties of the criminal law? And so you see great numbers of criminal charging for things like lack of motor vehicle registration and window tinting violations, of begging and sleeping in public parks. And in this way, this massive expansion of the criminal law has just created a huge net in which great segments of the population are picked up in, again, often for offenses that wouldn't align with the kind of things that we would expect the criminal law to attach to. And then sort of the end result, and there's so many things that happen to people along the way, and we can talk about those, but at the end of the line, what that means is that in the US, there are between 70 and 100 million people that have criminal records.
Wow.
And
Whew. I mean, that's huge, isn't it? So I think that the figure that you quoted was 1 in 3 have a criminal record, which is absolutely incredible, isn't it?
It's stunning. And the thing is that if you were to turn on the nightly news, you would think that our criminal system is just awash with charges of, murder and bloodshed. But the reality is it's fake news. It's just not the case. And that the majority of those offenses are low level, and the majority of those offenses are nonviolent. And we can dig into that a little bit. And we can talk about North Carolina as a microcosm, as an example of kind of how that plays out and what those charges really look like. But the impact of that is, with all those people having records, some of them are just arrest records. Some of them are conviction records. In many jurisdictions, you can be arrested of an offense, acquitted, and your criminal record still remains. It can be really hard to clear those criminal records, and those criminal records can have incredible consequences for people. So a criminal record for even a minor offense can end up being a sentence to a life in poverty because of employment and other consequences.
So it really means that, I mean, if you're an 18-year-old kid and you do something that, maybe a bit silly, but effectively you end up with a criminal record, because maybe you were speeding or doing something like that, and you end up with a criminal record. And then when you actually come into the jobs market, you're applying, but you're an applicant with a criminal record. And it isn't differentiated between, kind of something minor and something serious. I mean, that's got huge social and all sorts of implications, isn't it?
It really does. And you asked about the whole Second Chance initiative, which is wrapped up in something also called a Clean Slate initiative, which are ideas about how to get people better access to be able to clear their records after a certain time. But you've really hit on a great example. A lot of people make mistakes of youth, of hot-headedness. They get into a fight in a bar over a love interest at 18, or they drink too much and maybe smash someone's mailbox, and relatively minor offenses. But now fast forward, they're in their late 20s or they're in their 30s, they haven't picked up any other offenses, but they've got this criminal record that comes up and makes them ineligible for employment. So the basic concept behind Second Chance is figuring out who are the people who are ready to enter the workforce and be successful members of society. And that involves a couple of steps. And one of those steps is understanding the criminal justice system and being able to fairly evaluate records, understanding that example you gave of the person who picked up the conviction at 18, they're not the same person when they're 29 or 30 or 40, and evaluating that offense in context. And that's part of what's embedded in the whole idea of second chance hiring. And there's kind of a methodology that business leaders talk about, and we can discuss that as well.
But does the second chance, so say I am the 18-year-old, God knows that'll be a long time ago, but say I am the 18-year-old, and I do get that. Does the second chance wipe that completely clean off my record, or is it still there on my record somewhere?
Yeah, so there's kind of two different concepts that we need to distinguish. There's one about clean slate initiatives. What clean slate is about is it actually is about something called expunction, which is a legal process that allows people to obtain or it can be an automatic process to clear records for certain records, for minor offenses, after perhaps someone has had a clean record for 5 or 6 years. That's one process. Second chance hiring is really an entirely different animal, but it's all coming at the same issue. It's coming at the issue of how do we address the tremendous business needs there are for talent, but all these people who have criminal records and under, sort of the traditional way of doing things are just shut out of the process entirely. And part of what's involved with second chance hiring is coming up with procedures to appropriately evaluate that record. In other words, it's different than erasing it
Right.
or just a ban the box type approach, what people sometimes talk about. This is really a business program to bring talent in, and one of the components of a successful program is just fairly evaluating those charges and deciding, does that conviction from someone who is 18 really matter for the position that you're hiring for?
Okay. So to clarify in my own mind, where you're talking about the second chance, is that looking at and dealing with these kind of very minor transgressions, or would it also include slightly more serious transgressions, but I've rehabilitated, I've done my time, and does it
Sure.
cover that?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, it covers whatever the business wants it to
Right.
cover, but let's just step back for a minute. And in the US, we have sort of two buckets of crimes. We've got misdemeanor offenses and felony offenses. Misdemeanor offenses tend to be, your lower level offenses. Your felony offenses are the more serious ones. Typically, the line is a felony, you can get more than a year in prison, essentially. But sort of just to step back for a minute, most people are in the system because of a minor, low-level, nonviolent offense. And we've got lots of data that we can talk about on that. But many folks that are involved in second chance hiring do look at individuals who have felony convictions, because not all felony convictions are the same. And I'll just give you one example. Here in North Carolina, passing a worthless check is a misdemeanor. It's charged as a misdemeanor offense. It's called worthless check. But that offense, depending upon who the prosecutor is in your jurisdiction, can also be charged as a felony of obtaining property by false pretenses. So that's an example of an offense that has a felony status. So if I'm charged with it as a felony, I have the felony arrest and potentially conviction record, but someone in the neighboring county that was charged as a misdemeanor might have a misdemeanor offense. So there are businesses that are looking at felony offenses, and they're asking, what was the underlying conduct? Is it relevant for the type of position? And is it relevant for this person given the arc of their life? So for example, a felony embezzlement charge, you probably don't want to consider that person for a job that deals with handling money. But it may be
not the financial controller job is unlikely that they're going to get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for someone to move boxes in your warehouse, it may not matter. So again, a key concept of second chance hiring is fairly evaluating what could be just a charge or what could be a conviction record for the applicant in question.
Yeah. And because I just find it really, because if you think about it, I mean, and obviously you know this better than I, but when you think about the kind of the long tail of having a record, in a sense, it almost can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, can't it? In the sense that, if I have a record, then I can't get a job. If I can't get a job, I'm probably more likely to get into crime. And therefore the cycle just keeps on repeating itself, and then I don't come out of it. So that the repeat recidivism it's a big issue, isn't it? And having this kind of thrust upon me at an early stage can just be the start of a downward spiral.
Yeah, it's really true. The consequences of a criminal record are really catastrophic. Earlier, when we were talking, I said that a record for a minor offense can end up with being a sentence to a life of poverty. And that's really true. I didn't sort of come up with that language. It actually comes from a very conservative prosecutor that I was working with on a major state reform project. And the words he used was a misdemeanor conviction can be a sentence to a life that never gets above the poverty level. And there are a number of reasons wrapped up in it. One, right, it excludes people from the job market, but it also excludes people from a lot of other things. Housing. A lot of landlords do a criminal background check, and they won't rent to someone who has certain criminal record. Military service, getting into college, getting college financial aid, eligibility for benefits. I mean, there are just a host of things that attach, and all of those things that attach, we know, are factors that can lead to recidivism. So, there are folks that work in the policy field and see second chance hiring as a way that the business community can be sort of an interrupter in that cycle of recidivism. From the business community, it's actually a business strategy that can enhance profits, which can be really beneficial. But the other thing, when we talk about the long tail, those sort of consequences I mentioned were for the individual. Well, a lot of these people have children. I mean, about half of children in America have a parent with a criminal record. So the tail is also setting up for intergenerational poverty, because when children grow up in homes where the parents can't get education and they can't get employment, it sets them up for further struggles and further difficulties. So the consequences really are very, very significant.
Yeah. And when was second chance passed?
Well, okay. So there are a lot of iterations of Second Chance Act and Second Chance record clearance strategies. Here in North Carolina, the Second Chance Act was actually passed after the killing of George Floyd. It was unanimously passed by our legislature in sort of that a movement that really was focusing people on the incredible inequities and disparities around race and socioeconomic factors that exist in the justice system. It's a relatively limited law in North Carolina that primarily gives individuals the benefit of some other changes that we made that didn't operate retroactively. But across the country, you really see a wave of legislation that affords some kind of criminal record relief for all of the reasons that we're talking about. Just 2 weeks ago, I believe the governor of Michigan signed a very comprehensive record clearance. So, sentiments are changing. There's changing among policymakers. Folks are beginning to understand the consequences of criminal record, and they're also changing among businesses. So even absent record clearances, with businesses focused on second chance hiring.
Yeah. So is it too early at this stage to have any data that would demonstrate success or otherwise?
Well, when you talk about second chance hiring, there is some evidence. There's evidence that companies that engage in second chance hiring end up with really engaged and loyal employees. And if you think about it, based on our conversation, that makes sense. It's really hard for someone with a record to get employment. So when a company gives them a chance, they're going to be very loyal. And, they have relatively low turnover numbers, which is a huge economic issue for businesses with, when you're down employees, with the lost productivity and the cost of recruiting and hiring and all of those issues. There are some studies done that indicate that, folks do, have no greater negative results in terms of employment than anybody, off the street without a record. So there are a lot of, optimistic, numbers and results that are showing, including a great way for employers to access a completely untapped talent pool for their needs. I mean, business needs always include at the top of the list hiring talent. And when you take those 70 to 100 million people off the table, you're taking a huge number off your talent pool. And also the other thing I'd add is, in the current environment that we're in, it's also a really important business strategy for companies to pursue their diversity and inclusion issues, which and customers are demanding.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, it comes in under that. I suppose if you look at then from the business side, and I appreciate that, you're looking from the legal side, but if you look from the business side, it's got to end up being a policy of the business, because it takes some education, it takes some understanding, it takes some knowledge. So how do you go about, to go to an organization and say, hey, listen, we can open up another 70, 100 million people that you potentially can employ. That's great. Okay. But if you get down into the detail of it, how do you train and educate the organization to embrace it and to actively to do it? Because I could understand somebody, for example, at a middle management level, right, is unlikely to take the chance if the endorsement isn't coming from the top, because if it goes wrong, somebody's going to look at it and say, hey, this person has a criminal record, why'd you do that? Well, it was second chance. Yeah, okay, that's not going to sound too clever. So how do you go about educating the organization?
Yeah, so again, I'm not a expert in corporate culture,
No, sure.
HR. I'm in criminal, but I've certainly spoken to a lot of business leaders, and I think there's a consensus. And there, first of all, there are a lot of companies that are already doing this. So a business that's interested to do it, one thing that they can do is go seek out another second chance company that's already doing it. Google it. It's easy to find those companies, and a lot of times those companies are more than willing to share their experience, even with competitors sometimes. But in terms of what business leaders say, there are, sort of maybe 5 kind of key components to making second chance work. And your question kind of hit on one of them, which is that it's got to be a corporate strategy that starts at the top. It has to be endorsed by the top of the business leaders for a number of reasons, one of which you mentioned, which is that folks in the middle are going to be worried about potentially taking a risk if the strategy hasn't been endorsed from the top. The second piece of it is the company needs to connect with partners who can supply the reliable talent pipeline, and we can talk about what that means. Third, there has to be appropriate interviewing and screening. And so the screening kind of gets to the issues that we talked about, which is fairly evaluating the record, which does involve some education on the part of the hiring manager or HR people to understand, for example, that a worthless check can be charged as a misdemeanor or a felony, and understanding the context. Is it something the person picked up when they were 18 versus something they picked up last year? Those types of things. For providing appropriate support, and we can talk about what that means. And then finally, having appropriate communications within and outside of the organization. And again, there are quite a number of details to unpack in there, but you hit on the corporate culture, which is number one. And you also hit on what falls under the umbrella of the sort of interview and evaluation, which is understanding the criminal justice system and being able to put the record in context.
And just one you mentioned there, which is interesting, that and this is about building that pipeline. How do
Yeah.
you see organizations going about building that pipeline? Because, I said it's a great Untapped, but you've got to access it. So how do you build the pipeline?
Yeah, I think, again, hearing business leaders talk about this, this is kind of building the pipeline is actually wrapped up in risk mitigation. Because let's be honest, there are risks, associated with this. And sometimes those are perceived and sometimes those are actual. But what business leaders say is the best way to access the pipeline is to create strong partnerships with those in the community who work with individuals that have records. And there are kind of a wealth of organizations that those might be. Those might be faith-based organizations. Those could be government organizations that are involved in reentry. Here in North Carolina, we have something called local reentry councils that actually receive funding to support individuals reintegrating into the workforce and into society. So those organizations are great to partner with. Sometimes it can be with individuals in the criminal justice system. It can be with prisons, with probation officers, with parole officers. The key to this is connecting with partners who know the people well, because from the business perspective, what they want to do is they want to be interviewing the people who are ready to turn their lives around, right? Have the people who know them best, who have worked with them through, whether it's the tail end through supervision and probation and parole, or in a nonprofit capacity, who know the individuals, who can vouch for the individuals, and then supply the ready talent, the people that are ready to turn their lives around, to the businesses to then evaluate as part of a second chance process.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary. I mean, I was fascinated when I heard you speak about it, because I think that, I mean, I deal with a lot of organizations in different countries, and, and one of the one of the you hear them crying out all the time is attracting and retaining talent. And when you think about the whole principle of second chance, where it's bringing some very qualified, talented people who really want to change their lives, and also the impact of a higher retention with people with second chance, which is a huge saving to the organization, because where you've got higher turnover of staff, it's a massive expense. But I think also from the social perspective is that if you can break this chain of where you get into, you can't get a job, so therefore I'm in the poverty loop, and therefore I get into crime because I'm in the poverty loop, and it just repeats itself, and that goes from generation to generation. The social impact of what you're doing is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm just fascinated to hear the experience that you've had in talking to organizations about the experience they've had doing it.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would emphasize about that is I do think in the current environment that we're in, both employees and customers are looking for their companies to actually solve some of the complex social problems. But what business leaders say over and over again is that you shouldn't come at this from the perspective of charity. This is about business profitability. This is about hiring great employees who are going to work incredibly hard and stay with you for a long time. And the companies that do it, indicate they're really happy with their employees. The other piece that we haven't touched on yet is there are some really compelling stories about how engaging in second chance hiring has really transformed companies. And I'll share one story with you.
Please do, yeah.
If I'm it's not my story. I was on a panel with Jeff Karesnik, who's with Fifth Third Bank, and he's been a big proponent of second chance hiring, as have others at Fifth Third. And he talked about an example of a packaging company that's located in Ohio. They were involved in making open-end envelopes, and they were a very traditional manufacturing company that aimed to be, the top seller of open-ended envelopes, but they also lived in a rural area without a lot of transportation and were really struggling to get employees to work at the company. And so the CEO began what they called fair chance hiring process. And it had some bumps in the road, but they currently report that apparently 31 of their 150 employees are actually fair chance hires. And then even skeptics within the company have really turned their views about the quality of those employees. But something else also happened, and that is that this experience and having so many fair chance hires now in the workforce caused the company to actually change its business purpose. And its business purpose is now better solutions, better lives, and better world. And that purpose, according to Jeff, who's done a lot of research at looking at these case examples, has actually kind of catapulted the company and made it so much more profitable in other ways. So, for example, in addition to fair chance hiring, they started looking at environmentally friendly products to produce their materials, which has made them a better company. And he one of the I thought was so striking that Jeff talked about is that previously the sales force would go out and their kind of thinking was, well, the more envelopes I sell, the more money we make. Okay, so that's motivating, but apparently now the motivation is the more envelopes we sell, the more people we can hire, and we can transform their lives. And that's just so much more motivating for the individuals doing the work. And in fact, folks that do this say that companies that engage in this do tend to have both employees who are more innovative, but the company culture also can change. And that story to me was just a really striking one about how you may start with an idea of enhancing your workforce, but the benefits can really be incredibly tremendous for the company. Jeff has a book coming out. I don't get any any profit from it, but he has a book coming out, and I'm really interested to read it because I know has these kinds of conversations with a number of companies that have engaged in the process. So the stories are out there and they're really compelling.
Well, what I mean, it's a great place to kind of end the interview, because I think also what it plays back to is that when you talk about, I mean, and this is under the umbrella of diversity and inclusivity,
Mhm.
so it plays into that. And I think to your point, it's not just about the tokenism or you're doing it out for charity, but that you embed it into the values of the organization, and that organization clearly did embed it as a value into that organization. And there's no doubt about it that, I mean, and the research would support it, is that the organizations who embrace diversity and inclusivity and do it really well, it does actually have an impact on bottom line. So I mean, this falls into exactly the same category. Jesse, we could continue talking, but I want to respect your time. This has been fantastic, really, really interesting, and it was a subject I really wanted to share with the audience, because I know that they would find it hugely valuable. How can people get in touch with you and your organization?
Uh, Go on the web and Google Criminal Justice Innovation Lab. They can reach out. We've got all kinds of resources to help people understand about the justice system a little bit better. And folks can contact us through the web too.
That's fantastic. Jesse, thank you so much for being a guest today on A Life and a Living. It's been a real honor, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.